there have been offers for giving talks in this teaching from various parts of the country, and especially from various departments in this university. So given time, we will have, who knows, this may continue year-long, given the enthusiasm that has been shown by departments of science, departments of philosophy, the School of Arts and Aesthetics, and practically every department in this university who are eager and enthusiastic to participate in this teaching. That's the first thing I want to report. I also want to make a very brief introduction to today's speaker, Professor G. Arunima, who is the chairperson and a professor at the Center for Women's Studies in JNU. Before that, I would like to say that for 2 days now, we've had an introduction to how we might think about the nation, not as some natural geographical unit, not as something that is some irreducible essence, but as something that requires constant reiteration through political activity, through involving people in various kinds of political action. But above all, I think both Professor Guru and Professor Arisitas emphasized that that when one speaks of nationalism in some progressive sense, one does not speak only of some essence which has to be somehow nurtured and which is the prerogative of any one group or even any one party, but rather that when the ideal has always been to ally the idea of nationalism to notions of equity and justice, and that has been a much more difficult goal to reach. That has been, in some cases, even an impossible goal to reach. And that does not happen naturally. It happens through conscious effort. We've had a very strong plea being made for constitutions, constitution making, and obedience to constitutions as a possible way of moving forward on questions of freedom, equity, and justice. We also have a different narrative for our own history of anti-colonial nationalism, because as you know, it did not reach all regions of the country in the same way. And the South is a particular location where a different set of questions arose vis-a-vis the presence of the British. I would like to just start today's lecture without in any way presuming to preempt Professor Arunima's talk by recalling the words of the Kannada novelist Kuvenpu, K.V. Puttappa, who also won the Jnanpith Award, who said that had it not been for British rule, we would never have been free of Brahmin rule. So there were large areas of India which saw the British in slightly different terms, the colonialism as such, in slightly different ways. And I hope today what Professor Arunima is going to offer us is one such perspective. Arunima?
I would request everyone to please sit down so the people in the behind can also see and listen to this.
Before I start saying anything, I must say that Ari has set an impossible task of spinning around. So I'm told that I must spin around and dance when I speak to you. This is not very easy because unlike Gopal, who came without any notes, I actually had to think a lot about what I want to actually say to you today. And I thought that the way to address the national question as it is unfolding in front of us, no, thanks, useless though I am, would be to actually, for us to collectively think about the region. Okay, that was enough? All right. Now, before I start thinking together with you about the region and why I thought that the region might be a productive way to enter the question that we are engaging right now, I do want to make a few prefatory remarks about my own position vis-a-vis some of the kinds of issues that we are engaging at the moment. So I have to say that coming from a time and a generation where my own imagination was structured by all kinds of various things, from Tagore and his famous poem Where the Mind is Without Fear, which, as you know, speaks very eloquently and written, if you know, in Bangla in 1910 and translated into English in 1912, speaks very beautifully about a future for an entire humanity, instead of it being broken into small walls of domesticity. That plus thinking about the Workers' International, which actually dreamt of an international world order which would be completely different, where workers' unity would actually be what would define the ways in which we thought about ourselves, and not again through small domestic walls of sort of nation and so on. And finally, as they say, last but not the least, John Lennon. And thinking about Imagine, I have to say I come from a time that is, you know, not so wedded to the manners in which people are actually reiterating a desperate and violent and sort of intense passion for the nation. I would put myself down as somebody who's a bit nation agnostic. I'm an Indian, my parents are Indians, I have a passport and so on and so forth, but I don't have to wake up every morning and start swearing my allegiance to the country. So what are the kinds of questions that came to my mind when there was this issue of thinking about the nation? So I must start this by saying that one of the things, as primarily a student of history, whose present location is not in a history department, I'm always struck by the fact that the nation is quite a recent social form, if we want to think about it like that. If we do not want to think about it within the kinds of normal sort of, you know, political, territorial ways of imagining it, and we think about it more as a social form, it's not such an old social form. 2.5 centuries is not such a long period of time. And certainly students of history will bear me out on that. And those of you who are, you know, history aficionados will also realize that, you know, if we were to study, say, histories of feudalism, those actually spread over centuries. So what is it about the nation then that sort of makes one have to constantly speak about oneself and in relation to the nation in certain kinds of ways? Now, there are 2 or 3 kinds of things that I think are significant before we get on to the region. One, of course, and you know, I think my colleagues here who come from, say, departments of political studies, and since this is actually not, I mean, it's meant to be a class, even though we are standing here like rock stars, I think it is important to remember the fact that yes, there are political and territorial issues at stake when we speak about the nation, but there are also affective issues. And it's the sort of coming together in not very predictable ways, the political, the territorial, and affective, in the kinds of thinking and writing and politics of different kinds of people that often does create this kind of conflictual environment in which people begin to get extremely angry and extremely bellicose and extremely passionate and so on and so forth. So it's worth bearing that in mind. The second is a point that Ari had made yesterday, and which I would want to reiterate in a slightly different way, which is that when we think about the histories of nations and the so-called birthing story of the nation, the stories coming from, as it were, anti-colonial context is quite different from the kind of master narratives that we have from the European birth of the nation stories. And I think that is important because if you think about nationalism, so ideas about black consciousness or ideas like Marxism, these in the colonies are very different from the kinds of ways in which they were written about, thought about, articulated in, let us say, European context. And I'm not saying that as some kind of hermetically sealed difference with one another, but I think, or that they're not internally differentiated in those regions or in ours, but I think there is something about the production of ideologies in different ways, in different political contexts of histories, which we do need to think about. Now that's what then made me think about this business about how do I address this question. I want us to think about 2 phrases which certainly every Indian knows. One is "we the people," right? And of course, Barkhadat has made that, you know, world famous in India, as it were, as they say. The other is the phrase unity in diversity. Right? Now, I want us to think about both of these, because what I want to talk to us about today is the way in which one can have an imagination of a nation via its people, and what would that mean? And what does the question of diversity actually force us to think about? Is it simply pluralism? Is it simply differences of culture? Is it simply the fact that I speak Malayalam, alongside with Hindi when I'm forced to, and so on and so forth, and all of that? Or the fact that there are actually structural, material, cultural, political differences in the country, right? So I want us to think about the idea of difference, not just diversity, because I think difference is a more productive political concept to think about, and I want us to keep the idea of people in our mind, right, when we speak about this. And here I want to say that there is a very beautiful, what it came out first as a TED talk, and subsequently apparently the text of that came out. I haven't seen the text of it. The Nigerian writer, this beautiful Nigerian writer called Chimamanda Adichie, spoke, and that was called The Danger of a Single Story. Right? And I think for me, that's a really moving title. And I also think for the kinds of issues that we are addressing here, the idea of a single story is something that we must be very wary of. So what are these different kinds of stories? What are these stories that will not add up? What are these stories that we want to keep in mind? What are these stories that frighten and disturb us? What are the stories that empower us? What are the stories that fill our dreams? Right? So let us keep these differences, the idea of difference, the ways in which dreams and desires are made, right? So what I want to talk to us about today is the manner in which the region gets imagined. It's not only about that famous phrase of Ben Anderson's, the title of his book, The Nation as an Imagined Community. I would suggest that there are actually different rhythms from regions, different imaginations from regions, which are actually very productive for us to think of. Right? And if we work productively with these modes of thinking, with these modes of dreaming, and understanding what these desires are about, I think there would be a way of going with the flow of what that is actually suggesting, rather than feeling threatened and thinking that this is sort of contra to some other larger homogenization kind of tendency. Now, before that, I must tell you, about, I, of course, as Janki mentioned, I think, for one large part of my work is on Kerala, on the southwestern coast of India, exceedingly marginal region. Even though this place might be full of Malayalis, of course, as somebody once told me, Malayalis and mosquitoes are found everywhere. So, it is a fact that you do have Malayalis everywhere for, again, very interesting historical reasons. But there is a serious reason and a slightly facetious example I want to give you about the regional identification. Right? And as Janki said, I do want to think about South India. Now, the facetious thing is, for years together, I taught in a South Delhi college called Lady Shri Ram. And one day I went into the canteen of Lady Shri Ram College, and I looked to see what I should eat. And on the canteen menu, put up on the board, it said Indian and South Indian. And I thought, okay, that is interesting. All right, so this is the kind of way in which we think about our difference. Food habits. Of course, we know there is food and there is food. So, be that as it may, it didn't have food, it had food, but we will come back to that in a bit. The other equally amusing example was a friend of mine from Kerala who lives and works in Delhi, many years back, when his daughter was very little, went to his hometown in Calicut in North Kerala. And after a few days, his 5-year-old daughter asked him, so, Acha, when do we go back to India? And I think there is something about the manner in which difference gets imprinted in our minds. We feel we are different. We are made to feel we are different. There are ways in which differences get articulated. And I think there's something important to think with. Now, in the mid-1980s, I was an MA student here in the Center for Historical Studies, and I, with great happiness, would say that the reason I stayed in academics after that is actually because of that MA. So my identification from JNU, with JNU, comes mainly from that moment in my sort of personal sort of association with this institution, but of course for more than the last decade I've been teaching here. Now, when I used to sit in modern Indian history classes there, which were fantastic, I have to say I went from class to class wondering why was it that I never studied anything about Kerala. There was absolutely fabulous histories of different parts, Bengal of course, a little bit of UP, Bengal again. Then we studied about maybe a little bit of Maharashtra, if I remember, a little bit of Punjab, because fortunately there was a scholar who worked on that area. Certainly the communist movement paper had Kerala in writ large, but other than that, we studied Bengal and we studied Indian history, right? So there is an interesting question, and I must say it is at that time then that I thought that if I do stay in academics, because in all those years I thought that this is my last degree, I'm going to leave now and do something rather more fun with my life. This is fun, I'm not saying it's not. I have to say this was the question that was a pressing question for me, which is, apart from the facts of feeling different growing up in a city like Delhi, there was also the fact that in the mid-1980s, even the best classes did not actually teach anything about regions that many of us came from. I'm sure that is true even today, and I know there are complex reasons for that. Several years down the line, you do need to have research on the area for it to be taught. You can't simply teach it. I do recognize that, and I'm thrilled that, for instance, in this university, which is probably the first place in the country, there will actually be an MPhil program in Northeast Studies. So I think that is a wonderful change that is actually going to come. So I think there are sort of, the last 2.5 to 3 decades have produced enormously serious amount of work on different regions. Now, how does one actually think about this thing called the region? Do you think about it as a geographical unit? Do you speak about a region because different places come to, they're close by, so Tamil Nadu and Kerala are a region, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka region, there is all of South India, just because, LSR's canteen says South India, are we South Indians? When people frequently, and as all the South Indians here will know, that the generic difference of North and South is always between Madrasis and Punjabis. All the time that we complain that they call us Madrasi, I think it's good to remember that we always call every North Indian Punjabi. And also in a very, very sort of not appreciative manner, shall we say. So, there's a lot of equality here. In sort of the ways in which we caricature, the ways in which we think about the other, and I think there's something reasonably harmless about that. I don't think we need to be so hot and bothered under the collar about that. But be that as it may, what are we speaking about? Are we speaking about political structure, social structure, kinship? What are we talking about? Is it an idea? Is it an identification? Is it something that's attributed? Like people saying, oh, you're a South Indian, right? I'm not a South Indian, but you are a South Indian. Yeah? Is that the manner in which we think about the region? And in that context, the question of South India does become important. But what I want to speak about are the manners in which the rhythms of regions produce different kinds of articulations. And for this, I'm going to talk to us very, very briefly, because I think I have another 15 minutes. I will speak to us very briefly about few issues that come up from Tamil Nadu and some issues that come up from Kerala, and think about what that actually means about a kind of imagining the region and the kinds of ways in which that imagination, the question of rhythms, the longue durée, as it were, the long term of the rhythms can make us actually think about the kinds of questions that become very pressing in the contemporary moment, one of which is the question of identities, even though I'm not directly speaking to that. Having said which, I think I want to flag that right at the outset, which is that if you think about the regional, what is also equally important is that the region is internally differentiated. And that differentiation is not only because somebody speaks Tamil and somebody speaks Malayalam, but also because there are any number of other issues that are at stake, which I want to actually place at least a few of these before us. And before I get on to that, I just want to remind us of Adichie's danger of a single story. So in that sense, I think what is at stake for us is to remember that the story of the nation, which might be, I'm not saying it's that's the only way, and there's been some profoundly serious historical work. Of course, people in political studies have done other kinds of work on it, but since I engage far more directly with the work of historians, I would say there's been profoundly serious historical work that has been done on thinking about the nation historically in the Indian context. So it's not that there is only one story, but one of the kinds of dominant narratives is that of the freedom struggle and the national movement, and the nation is often seen within that kind of framing. And the point about making sort of saying that we need to engage the region in relation to this single story of the nation is to actually say that these differentiated imaginations, these differentiated rhythms coming from the regions might actually make us, or make it possible for us to actually at this contemporary moment rethink the nation in the times ahead of us. Right? Now, if you think about Tamil Nadu, there are two things. I mean, there are hundreds of things, of course, but two kinds of framing sorts of, shall we say, terms that one can actually use, two kinds of analytical terms that one can actually use for thinking about Tamil Nadu. One is the question of language and the issues around Tamil language. And I know that many of you who are from the History Center and remember Pandian will know that he resolutely refused, being a die-hard DMK man, to ever speak in Hindi. So there is a kind of affective relationship to language with the Tamil people have had. And I think there's something around that one needs to think about, and the question of caste. And if you think about Kerala, the language question does come up, but there are other imaginations. There is an imagination of class, there is an imagination that comes from not necessarily the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but from a much longer period. And that is where, I want to actually take us to thinking about that, which is actually a regional imagination that situates a place like Kerala within the wider geography of the Indian Ocean. There would be no Kerala had there not been that wider geography. Because if you actually think about Kerala and you say, oh, there are Christians and Muslims and Jews, and well, most of the Jews have gone, there are about 6 of them left, and Hindus and so on and so forth, different castes. Well, the question is, why is Kerala populated in this manner? Why are all these people Malayali today? How do we think about that? And that can only be understood if you actually push the story back to at least the 16th century, if not earlier, and you think about waves of groups of people who came from different parts, all the way from the sort of West Asia and the Arab world on the west to China on the east, with Southeast Asia thrown in. And unless and until one understands Kerala within this larger kind of Indian Ocean geography, there is no way in which you can make any sense of Kerala. But I'll come back to that point later. I actually want to, in this class, focus really on the question of how certain kinds of political imaginations in the Tamil context and in the Kerala context sort of are different, and why that's a productive thing for us to think with. Now, in the Tamil context, as I'm sure practically everybody here will know, because one of the good things about JNU is that much of the best discussions, I'm sure, happen outside of class. This is something we all know, and there's a lot of really, I say this with great seriousness. I deeply appreciate the fact that every dhaba has students sitting and discussing till very late at night. And I must say, even during one of these days when I was walking down, I had gone to the center for something, I was running back here, and I took I was behind 3 students, and they were talking about something very intensely, and I walked in front of them, and they were talking in Telugu, which I don't understand, but all I could understand was Havamas. So I thought, this is JNU. this is what happens. You are in a Tower of Babel in a sense. There are many, many different languages, but there is intensely serious intellectual engagement. And as we know, the coming together of the intellectual and the political is extremely important. And the attack on universities all over the country is precisely to try and stop this, because the biggest weapon is the mind. And unless and until we control the mind through sort of rigorous intellectual activity, this won't happen. Now, going back to the Tamil question, as we all know, E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, Periyar, who, as you know, from the late 20s, 30s onwards, well into the 60s, brought together at least 3 or 4 different kinds of questions. He brought together the question of self-respect, anti-Brahminism, the question, the political kind of way of imagining and raising the caste question, the question of gender equality, and abolition of caste itself, right? Now, it is a fact that if you actually think about the Periyar movement, and if you think about contemporary DMK, and this is why I was saying earlier, that's extremely important to understand that things are not static and things change. So we find with the contemporary DMK that many things have changed from the early Periyar movement, but I think it's important to bear this in mind when we think about a regional imagination. When sort of thinkers, political thinkers like Periyar were actually imagining what it meant to be free, these were the issues that mattered to them, right? So it was being articulated in this language. And there is one of the big drawbacks for many of us who are not Tamil readers is that not that much of Periyar has been translated. So most of us read it in translation from scholars who worked on this. But one of the sort of pithy, beautiful things that he said is the Brahmins' rule Swarajya for the pariahs or the untouchables? Is the cat's rule Swarajya for the rat? Is the landlord's rule Swarajya for the peasants? Is the rule of the property Swarajya for the laborers, right? So I think there is a very, very interesting and important critique of the idea of Swarajya, right? Who will be a part of the Swarajya? This is asking the people question. This is asking the question about difference. This is asking the political question about an ideal that you think about, right? If Swaraj is the ideal, who will be a member of that ideal, right? Who will be a member of that Swarajya when it is to come? This is the question that Periyar is forcing us to ask. And at least some of you might know that from the 40s through to the 60s, there was, starting with Periyar, taken up by Annadurai, there was actually a demand for Dravidistan. It was called Dravida Nada, Dravida Desham also. In 54, in fact, Annadurai said that Kerala and Karnataka could also be part of this political unit of Dravida Nada. There was lots of discussions and people who work on this, and I'm sure many of you will be excited enough to go and read more on the idea of Dravida Nada, because I think it's quite insightful given the kinds of issues that have brought us here today to think about this. But the interesting issue that Annadurai and others were raising, the motto that they were using is divide on the basis of language, unite on the basis of race. So there was an idea that there is a South India, that there is a racial difference, that there is a Dravida, right? There is a way in which this political imagination must be used, must be channelized to actually rethink the idea of this Swarajya, which will not include many, and particularly the underprivileged in the Dravida regions. Now, of course, when we look at the more sort of, the manners in which the Dravidian question gets articulated later, and, in 60s, again, those of you who know a little bit of Tamil history would know this, that from the 60s onwards, there were a series of suicides, right? And I have to say this, and these were on the language question. My Tamil pronunciation is terrible, but so I'm not going to tell you most of these because I'm going to pronounce it all wrong. But one of these, Udal Mannaka and Uir Tamirka, which is body to earth and life for Tamil, right? So they were all these are what Sumati Ramaswamy calls passions of the tongue, right? The manner in which the affective is generated. You identify so much with the language that your political identification, your affective identification, your emotional identification is actually with language. Now, I must say that, Malayalis just across the border from Tamil Nadu, we are, I think, secretly quite envious of the Tamilians and their ability to be passionate. We think we are far more, rational, and we don't sort of engage in these things. I've never heard of a single Malayali saying, okay, I'm going to kill myself for Malayalam. Never known. We'd rather draw cartoons, sit in toddy shops and maybe go watch a movie or two after that. Now, it's interesting that when the language question comes up in Kerala in the late 19th century, and it's important to remember that the idea of languages in the ways in which we understand today, and I think my colleague and friend Aisha Kidwai will speak to you tomorrow about this on the language question, and she's of course the specialist on that, so you will hear far more nuanced things from her. What I'm telling you is a certain kind of history about this, right? The late 19th century is a period when there is a lot of debate about the idea of Malayalam language. And the Malayalam magazines of that period, there is a lot of discussion on the idea of bhasha, right? What is the way in which one must speak about Malayalam? And one of the most dramatic statements by somebody who was writing in that period. I mean, many of these people, there's not much that we know about them subsequently. A man called C.D. David, who wrote enormously about this issue, he called it Samudaya Swat, community wealth. Right? Now, it's very, very interesting, this idea of language as shared, as common property, as something that everybody has equal access to. And I must say, when I think about this idea of Samudaya Swata, instead of this kind of passionate language identification, I think there's something really, really interesting about this imagination of language, which is actually quite different from this kind of almost life investment in language, which, as we know, is one of the kinds of conditions of huge amounts of warfare in this country and in the subcontinent itself. We know, of course, famously, the Hindi-Urdu kind of issue. So it is an interesting question about the imagination of language very differently, and this is why regions and regional differences and regional rhythms are so very important for us. Now, other than C.D. David, who wrote a lot and we don't know much about, I do want to make a point here, which is that when we also think about histories of languages, it's worth remembering who the people were who put these things together. In the Kerala context, again, it's extremely important to remember that the early histories of Malayalam, particularly, the people who were most significant in actually putting the kinds of, not the sort of grammar and histories of literature, but who were actually making it available, who were actually making it demotic, who were making it popular, who were making it possible for every Malayali to actually have access to Malayalam, were people like Kandatha Varghese Makpla, the journalist who set up Malayalam Manorama, Murkothu Maran, Tia Polymath, in today's language, lower caste intellectual, who was one of the most significant figures in the late 19th and early 20th century. So if you actually think about the figures who were involved in making Malayalam what it is, it was not a Savarna kind of enterprise at all. The people who were involved in it were either Avarna or, Avarna Christian, or there were some certain Christians as well. But what is interesting, of course, is this idea of a community investment in thinking language. And I must say, I find that quite enabling. Which is about another kind of rhythm, is the Kerala matrilineal story. Now, why is that significant? Why would that be relevant for us today? What do we learn from that? In the mid-19th century, and this is something that most people do not take much notice of, but I think it's worth reiterating, almost 50% of Kerala's population across class, across religious community and across caste was matrilineal, which basically meant that the inheritance was in the women's line, that children associated with mothers, that kinship was actually defined in the mother's line. Now, I think this is a really, really important, significant statistic and figure when one speaks about a extremely homogeneous notion of the family and family structures and patriarchy and so on and so forth. So what do we have from here when we, what can we take away from the matrilineal story? I think it is the question of difference of articulation of rights for women, right? And this is not simply rights over property, but also rights of sexuality. And I think that is the difference of matrilineal women, which is extremely important to remember. Now, it's another matter that it is the Kerala State Legislature which actually abolished matrilineal in 1976. But it is a fact that there is a manner in which, Malayali women will often speak about themselves or their grandmothers and speak about them as people who have a lot of self-assurance. Tandeda is the term that is often used. And it is a fact that there is something about the larger kind of cultural sort of ways of making, subjectivities of this kind that we do need to think about. They don't simply sort of boil down to simple kinds of, quantifiable kinds of data and so on and so forth. So we are speaking about greater autonomy, greater rights to sexuality and so on and so forth, which also was possible within this regional difference in the Kerala story. So in that sense, what I would want to say here, and I will very briefly speak about two other things in relation to Kerala, but just before I get to that, if we are to think about Tamil Nadu, then equality is being imagined via the question of eradication of caste, power and language. And in Kerala, the question is via the abolition of class power. And here I want us to think about two, amongst many others, but two significant figures of the early 20th century in the context of Kerala. One was Krishna Pillai, who was one of the founders of the Kerala Communist Party. He wrote in 1934 that communism believes that the whole world belongs to one caste, that is the human caste. Now, I think that that is actually a interesting kind of way of imagining the question of not just a region, but also a kind of, to use today's language, a post-national way of thinking or a post-regional way of thinking about the kinds of questions at stake. The other thing that he wrote, which was in 1934, in an essay called Fascism and Communism, the capitalists would be destroyed and the rule of the country will pass into the hands of the Daridra Narayan. Now, the language of that time notwithstanding, I think it is important to both acknowledge the fact that here is a communist ideologue who is actually frontally addressing the question of fascism and thinking about communism as the alternative, and also thinking about the manners in which class power and the sort of, the power of the working class would be the one that would actually be the kind of agency for political change. Again, if we go back to the danger of a single story and we think only about the freedom struggle and nationalism in very narrow ways, these are the stories that get left out. But it's also important that these are imaginations of equality, which are not only subsumed within a imagination of Swarajya. And I think that is something that I do want to place before us, that we want to actually think about that. Equally, if you think about a 1948 text, and there are various different ways of reading this, and I'm just telling you briefly about it because I think the title always amuses me. E.M.S. Namboodiripat's Kerala Malayaliyalde Madhrubhumi. Kerala, the Malayali motherland. So I think it is quite of course, the book doesn't go on to then outline that. It's actually very much within the kind of communist mode of production kind of argument about changes and how changes would actually happen, and thinking about the overthrow of feudal landlordism and the rightful place of the working classes. I mean, that is the kind of imagination within that. But I think the title is very significant. I don't think one should, sort of undermine the importance of the title that he gave. And the use of Malayali Madhrubhumi is an interesting kind of usage at a time when you have across the border speaking about people speaking about Dravida Nadu. So it is an interesting kind of differential rhythm within the region itself. And in a way, and one needs to work far more on this, but I want to place it here before us that and I have to say that I thank you all for this moment, because this is the first time I've done this as a Tamil Kerala reading together, and it struck me that there is something about the tensions between the kinds of larger regional imaginations that the DMK could have had, and the manners in which the Malayali communists were actually extricating themselves from within that kind of what they may have feared. I don't know, one needs to research this, but what they could have feared of a hegemony of a larger Tamil identity, even though Annadure and others were to go and say that Karnataka and Kerala would actually be autonomous within this. So I think there's something quite interesting there. So that's, in principle, the main things that I actually wanted to say to place here before us today. But what can we finally take away from some of these reflections? And I want to go back to the issue that I started with, which is the question of commitment to the people. And I think there I want to reiterate and underscore this question of difference. I think we do need to take difference seriously, because one of the most frightening things, which I think we are faced with every day in different ways, is the issue of homogenization. I think homogenization is not simply a question of making all of us the same, which is impossible, but it's also politically one of the most dangerous things, right? And I think difference in that sense, whether it's cultural or social or material, is not only about pluralism, it's also about political and social power differences. And therefore, unless and until we address the question of difference frontally, we will not be able to think about equality or social change and so on and so forth. So here I want to end with just one last thing, which is, even as the regional imagination shows us that there were other rhythms, other imaginations, other ways of thinking about selfhood and subjectivity, I must also say that looking at the kinds of ongoing violence of different kinds, and we are, we of course have been at the brutal end of one kind here, and we know that only too well and too intimately, and we all know here why, and I don't need to go into that. I think there is also a for me, because as I said to you, my imagination comes from an idea of an international, and I'm framed by those kinds of things. I do think that we would live in a wonderful world if we had none of the kinds of problems that we do, which are caused by borders and so on and so forth. But be that as it may, I think what is more important is to actually think that romanticizing deterritorialization faces us with the difficulties that the deterritorialized region might end up mimicking certain kinds of things about the nation. So what I want to end with is the question of violence. How do we actually think about the question of violence? And here I want us to, and my critique of violence derives from one of the many Germans whom I love, Walter Benjamin, and Walter Benjamin's critique of violence in one sentence, to simplify and to put it down in the in a kind of quotable quote, basically says to us that there is no good or bad violence. We do need to actually think about violence in a very different kind of a way. And if once that is said, then we are not saying that, my violence is okay, but your violence is not, right? So we do actually need to, and when I hear slogans of violence from whichever side, I think I am deeply disheartened, not because of anything, And that comes from my politics as somebody who has been within the women's movement, who has actually thought about feminism and politics. If I have fought for, a just world where there will be no violence against women, I cannot see how I can stand for a language of violence in any different kind of a way. So I think I want us to leave you with these kinds of thoughts. Thank you very much. You have been wonderful. Long live JNU!